Welcome back to the Word on Fire Show. I'm Matthew Petrusek, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the host of the Word on Fire Show. Thank you for joining us. Habemus Papam Americanum. The common wisdom up until a few weeks ago was that the church would never have a pope from the United States, or at least not until the U.S. ceases to be an economic and political superpower. But then, on May 8th, 2025, the College of Cardinals stunned the world by electing Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost, a native of the south side of Chicago. Before becoming Pope, Prevost, who has now taken the name Leo XIV, spent nearly 2 decades in Peru as an Augustinian missionary and gained significant experience working with the global church in the Vatican. He is, to be sure, a man of the world. A biographical fact he emphasized by speaking in Latin, Italian, and Spanish, not English, during his first introduction to the jubilant crowds in St. Peter's Square. All the same, Pope Leo XIV is and always will be a native son of the United States, a first in church history. So what kind of papacy should we expect from the American Pope? How should we interpret his papal name and his background as the former head of the Augustinian religious order? Are there any early signs of what his ecclesial, diplomatic, and moral priorities will be? And how should we think about him in relationship to his predecessors, including Pope Francis? Here to talk through these and related questions and to share his own experience of what it was like to watch the whole conclave unfold in person is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop, welcome back to the studio.
Thanks, Matt. Always good to be with you.
So today we're talking about what we might be able to expect from a Pope Leo XIV. I'm still getting used to saying that, Pope Leo XIV papacy, and what it was like for you to be there as the whole drama unfolded. But before we do, you also recently took another trip to our nation's capital to spend some time in a rather famous rose garden. So tell us a little bit about what that was about.
An extraordinary about 10 days, because I was with the president in the rose garden, and then about 2 days later, I flew to Rome to be there for the papal election. So it was a wild 10 days. Well, I was invited by the president to be part of this commission on religious liberty. And, we bishops have been concerned with religious liberty now for the past, 25, 30 years. It's been a major concern of ours. We have a committee dedicated to it. I'm on that committee. So when I got that invitation from the president, I thought, well, look, he's reaching out to a Catholic bishop to seek advice on an issue that we bishops think is of enormous significance. But why would I say no to that? So that's what motivated me to do it. Then they invited me to come to the ceremony and do a prayer at it. So that's why I actually went to Washington. I got a terrible sunburn with my Irish skin sitting in the rose garden because the president was delayed about an hour, whatever he was doing. And then he gave kind of a long speech. And the whole time, the sun is just beating down on me. So when I got to Rome, I was in kind of bad shape. It was like when I was a kid. I would get sunburned and my skin would peel and all that. So I had a adventure in dermatology at the rose garden. But it was an interesting day, and President Trump spoke about religious liberty and lots of other things, and then he invited us briefly into the Oval Office, for pictures. And we're going to meet a lot, actually, in the coming year. I think it's every month, with a couple of exceptions. And then we're supposed to produce a document by next July, by the anniversary, the 250th anniversary of the country, recommending, some changes and maybe in our public policy and about religious liberty. So that's the charge of the commission. A person I thought of a lot after I got the invitation was the famous Father Theodore Hesburgh, who was president of Notre Dame University back in the 20th century from, I think, 1952 to 1987. Hesburgh was a major public figure, and I checked this with my friend, Father Bill Miscampbell, who is a biographer of Hesburgh. He said, yes, he served on 16 separate presidential commissions under 5 presidents. 2 Republicans and 3 Democrats. So Hesburgh, civil rights and many other things. I thought, well, that's really what I'm doing here is accepting invitation from the president. And something Hesburgh said, I noticed, was it's hard to say no to the president. And I think that's true. Not that you're co-opted or brought into endorsing every single policy, but on this particular issue, he's seeking my advice. Right. I'm happy to give that.
Well, this news was widely cheered within the church, online, and outside of the church as well. But some usual quarters of complaint registered some principled objections. So what do you say to critics who say, look, a Catholic bishop does not belong on anything formally to do with any administration.
I just think that's false. All he's asking for is advice in the formulation of public policy. Why not be a Catholic voice around that table? If the president's reaching out to say, help me formulate good public policy in this regard, we think it's very important, and he wants a Catholic voice around the table. Why would I say no to that?
Right.
If it ever reached a point where I felt that principles were being compromised or something was being done that I was opposed to, I'd quit. Look, I'm not angling to become governor of Arkansas or something. I mean, what can the president give me? I got a sunburn from being in the Oval or in the Rose Garden, but I mean, I'm not angling for political position.
Right.
So
what's the benefit? Yeah.
No. So I just see myself as offering a Catholic perspective on these things, and the commission will last maybe for a year, and then it'll be over.
Yeah.
So no, I think those are silly objections.
Yeah, it's a highly commonsensical
And then
response.
again, the same thing will be against Hesburgh. Why not go after Hesburgh for 16 times becoming a presidential commissioner?
Right.
Well,
let's now turn to today's topic, which is looking at this new papacy, the stunning election of Cardinal Robert Francis Prevost to the papacy, who's now taken the name of Leo XIV. Before analyzing his background, his theological influences, the significance of his name, everybody wants to hear what the experience was like for you to be there on the ground before the conclave started to its conclusion. What was that like?
It was exciting. I was there 12 years ago doing commentary for NBC. And it was funny, man. I don't remember that as being, how would I put it, as being somewhat exciting, or I wasn't nervous. I was just there, and okay, they're electing the Pope, and who's it going to be? Well, let's find out. This time around, I think everybody was a little more on tenterhooks, and well, who's it going to be? And what direction will the church go in? And so there was that excitement about it.
Do you have a sense of why there was that difference?
I don't know entirely. Maybe just for me, because I'm a little more engaged. I wasn't a bishop, 12 years ago. I was rector of the seminary at the time, but not a bishop yet. But there was great interest, excitement about it. And then the way the election unfolded was so surprising, because a lot of us were expecting a longer conclave, that there'd be more divisions and they have to kind of work through and maybe find a compromise candidate. So I was predicting, Friday, and maybe there'd be 7, 8, or 9 ballots or something. Turned out to be exceptionally fast. And I was actually on the roof of Bambina Maria, which is this religious house right next to St. Peter's. And NBC was on top of that. Or maybe it was the Augustinian, but one of the two. I was right there overlooking St. Peter's. And I was being interviewed. And I was just responding, looking into the camera. Nobody at that moment was expecting white smoke.
That's
no
right.
one.
Yeah.
And I'm just talking away, and suddenly behind me is this roar goes up. And I was like, wait, what are they possibly reacting to? And then someone goes, white smoke. So that was unexpected. Then I had to race over to Fox News, because I'd agreed to be with them when the Pope came out. So we raced across the city of Rome. And then when the announcement was made, I was even more flabbergasted.
Right.
Prevost's name had been mentioned, but all of us, myself included, all the commentators were like, I suppose it's possible, but they're not going to elect an American. I used the argument that Francis George always used, which was, until America goes into political, decline, it won't happen, because we're the superpower. We run the world politically, economically. We dominate the popular culture. They're not going to give us the church too. That was always the way Cardinal George put it. And I thought that's right. I think most people thought that was right. Well, it was wrong. They did elect an American, to everyone's enormous surprise. I knew him a little bit because, see, for me, a precursor of the conclave were the two synods.
Right.
I was there the last 2 Octobers, 2023, 2024. In the room at the synod, there were 400 of us. There were 60 cardinals. So I often said to people during the synod, I bet the next pope is in this room. Turned out to be true. But I can tell you this, no one would have said, oh, yeah, and it's Robert Prevost. I think we all would have said, Barron or Tagle or,
Right.
Turned out he was in the room. So I knew Prevost from the synod a bit. I remember the first time we met, I said to him, I'm from Chicago too. And I said, you've been given a big job, because he was head of the bishop's dicastery. He'd just been named. I had no idea he was going to get a pretty much bigger job, a few years later. And we just chatted about Chicago a bit and people we knew in common. Quiet man, not a flashy personality, smart, obviously, very experienced in different ways. But he's not someone that would stand out in the room like, oh, that guy, boy, he's got the big personality. Just the opposite. So, all of that contributed to my experience of being over there. I was flabbergasted, I must say, when the name was announced. And that added to the excitement of it.
Oh, well, you and everyone else. We'll talk more about the American part of his identity. But to back up sort of before the conclave, there was a lot of chatter that the fact that Pope Francis had selected so many cardinals from outside the traditional power centers, outside of the Vatican, that was going to have a significant influence on the new pope. Do you think that prediction played out in any way?
In a way, I think it did. There's so many from the third world. And again, I think of the Synod. It was like a warm-up for the conclave, because the Synod, too, people from all, Africa, Asia, Latin America. And one thing that a lot of, look at Africans, Asians, Middle Easterners, and many Europeans, too, would have in common is the English language.
Right.
And so someone that speaks English, at the Synod, I think we had 12 or 13 tables of English speakers, maybe 7 tables of Italian speakers, maybe 4 of French, maybe, English was the dominant language.
Right.
And English unites the world. That was a beautiful thing. I was, of course, at these English tables, but it meant you had prelates from Africa, Asia, Middle East, Europe, North America, all over the world. I think that was important, that there was an English speaker who was one of the candidates, united a lot of these disparate figures. And, let's face it, too, a lot of people that didn't know Rome very well, they weren't part of the kind of inside baseball crowd. They weren't curial people. And then the fact that Prevost was the head of the dicastery for bishops meant a lot of bishops knew him.
Right.
Because the ad limina visits, when bishops go to Rome, you meet with the Pope eventually, but you meet with all the curial department heads, and one of the main ones would be bishops. And because we always have concerns or issues or questions. And so he would have met a lot of bishops from around the world, including cardinals. All that contributed to it, I think. He was, I think, something of a compromise candidate, which is often the case in conclaves. If, let's say, a Parolin that everyone mentioned, I think he did get a lot of votes. Erdo on the conservative side, I think, did get a lot of votes. But it became clear pretty quickly, I think, that neither one was going to carry the day. I've heard there's rumors of other names like Otagle and others that might have gotten some attention. Even Cardinal Sarah, I heard that. And this will come out. It always happens. They take vows secrecy, but it all comes out eventually. That Sarah got some votes, but they knew it would never carry the day. And then they begin casting about for a compromise. And I think Prevost, for a lot of reasons, emerged as a compromise.
Bishop, help us understand when we use the word, liberal and conservative within the ecclesial circles. I think the outside world's temptation is to immediately impose political categories on there. So what do those terms mean more specific when you call, for example, Erdo a more conservative candidate versus Parolin?
Well, let's say when I'm using liberal here, maybe someone closely associated with the Pope Francis program. Synodality, the outreach to the margins, great stress on social justice, right? Conservative, someone more in the John Paul II model. Erdo would be seen as a John Paul II type figure, perhaps more concerned with doctrinal clarity, with the new evangelization, et cetera. So I'm speaking very broadly there, but there are some of those ideological points of demarcation.
Another very important dimension of the conclave, again, before we move into looking at Pope Leo in more detail, is just the media presence that was there. And you were intimately involved with all of these different major media networks. And what I found fascinating is they sent their A-list talent to go cover the conclave. And so I wanted to get your sense of why do you think there's such external interest in what's going on at the conclave, and to the degree they're sending their top talent, especially when a lot of the same media doesn't share the same values that the church has.
They know the importance of the papacy. Period. Whether you like the Pope or not, whether you like the Catholic Church or not, they know the power of the papacy. He's the most important religious figure in the world, and that's not Catholic jingoism or putting anybody down. It's just the fact. The most recognizable, the most influential religious leader in the world is the Pope. And so naturally people are interested. Does he have a huge political and cultural impact? Yes, obviously. So the news people are interested in that. Also, I would say the inherent drama of it. I mean, no one does drama better than the Catholic Church. And
That's true.
we invented it in a way. That what we call theater and all that often it really came out of the Catholic liturgy.
Yeah.
And so just the fact of, the smoke and the Sistine Chapel and then the dramatic appearance of the Pope on the loggia. I mean, all that stuff is so beautifully crafted, and it's just designed for television and designed for drama and what's happening. And no one does that better. And so, the news people, they all love that. I found they were all interested. I appeared on a whole slew of networks this time. 12 years ago, I was with NBC exclusively. This time we did kind of a freelance thing, which I like better. I was on CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, Fox, EWTN, all these different outlooks. And they were all good. They were all interested. They would usually, by the end of the brief interview, try to get you into a political position, and I would just tend to deflect those questions.
Yeah, you did so very deftly. But
that's what I would do.
They always tried to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I would talk about Catholic social teaching. I think this Pope is coming out of a Catholic social teaching tradition, which is neither left nor right. And, but I found they were very interested and they were, pleasant and friendly.
As part of my duty as host to represent our loyal viewers, burning questions, I have to ask you, Bishop, about the Panama Jack hat.
Oh.
Which you got a lot of compliments on, by the way.
Yeah, no, I was happy about that. It was the sunburn. It's from Donald Trump. It was the fact that I was in the Rose Garden and I got this terrible sunburn.
Yeah.
So my skin was kind of peeling. It was like being a kid again. I played too much baseball outside as a kid. And so I'd come to these interviews and, on my skin, they had to kind of give me extra makeup and all this. So then someone said, look, get a hat. Yeah. So protect yourself. And so we saw one of the priests there had that hat. I said, where'd you get that hat? And he told me the store. And so we just made a beeline. It was 10 minutes away. And within 5 minutes, they had the right size. And I said, all right, I'll take it. And so I wore it. It wasn't just for show. It's wherever you were, if the sun was out, I had that hat on to protect myself.
Well, you've rebranded it now as the Bishop Barron hat.
Good.
So Panama Jack.
It's
the Bishop
It's
Barron
a good hat. Yeah, it's a good hat.
All right. Well, let's now look, of course, at the fact that we do have the first American Pope, the first United States citizen Pope. Now, he made it very clear when he first came out on the loggia, and he spoke in Latin, he spoke in Spanish, and he spoke in Italian. So he didn't speak in English. He is a man of the world, 2 decades in Peru, a Peruvian citizen,
right? But
also a guy from the south side of Chicago. So, Bishop, you spent a lot of time in the Vatican. What's your sense of how the Vatican sees the American church, and are they going to impose that perception on the new Pope?
The line that was going around all the time was that people evidently were saying he's the least American of the Americans. I frankly find that insulting.
It is insulting.
But that's the line that I find it credible that some of the Italians would have said that, that if like a Cardinal Dolan was sort of sum up the stereotype of the kind of boisterous American, Prevost was the opposite extreme, kind of quiet and more international in style and all that. All right. I think at the end of the day, honestly, they voted for the man. I don't know if they were that preoccupied with his provenance and his citizenship. I think they recognized qualities in him that were papal. So I don't know if there's any great statement being made. People ask about, was it a rebuke to Trump and all that? I just don't think they were thinking along those lines. They saw him as a guy, for a variety of reasons, uniquely positioned for this job. So I don't know. I wouldn't want to overstate the American thing.
So you noted the importance of the fact that he's a native English speaker in getting elected among the cardinals.
Yeah.
How about for the sort of the future of the church, especially evangelically, the fact that we now have a native English speaker who's going to be speaking to the world?
I think it's great. And I'm sure already it's awakened a deeper interest in Americans in the church. I've thought a lot about this. I've now lived through a number of popes, and I've been bishop under, going back to, Francis. Of course, Francis may be a bishop. But, when you meet a pope, you think, okay, now what language will I speak, and will I understand him? And, he's coming from a totally different cultural background. The fact that if I have the pleasure, I hope someday to meet Leo as pope, that I'm going to a guy from the south side of Chicago.
Yeah, right.
That he's someone completely from my world. I think I said in a couple interviews, he grew up about a 25-minute drive from where I did. I grew up in Western Springs, southwest suburbs. He grew up in Dalton. Good traffic. He'd be there in 25 minutes. We're roughly the same age. He's maybe 4 years older or 5 years older than I am. So we're from the same, cultural matrix. That's interesting that I'll approach the Pope in a very different way, and that's all to the good.
I'm really looking forward to his first encyclicals,
Yeah.
which may first be written in English. That'll be
I
fascinating.
wonder.
So another very notable feature of the new Pope is that he's from a religious order, the
Yeah.
Augustinians, and another first, the first Augustinian to be elected to the papacy. So let's explore that a little bit, that dimension, deep dimension of his identity. Say a little bit, Bishop, about the special charism that the Augustinians have and how that might see that unfold in his papacy.
Yeah. It's an ancient order going back to Augustine himself, who gathered around himself in Hippo, the priests of his diocese, and they lived in a kind of monastic way. And that's the beginning of the Augustinian order, which is ancient, and it's endured all these centuries. It bears the marks of Augustine, of deep intelligence. He was a man of the heart as well, so it's that combination. They're involved in education. They're involved in missionary work, as this man was most of his career. But I think it's the Augustinian stamp, as Francis had the Ignatian stamp. And when people ask me about Francis, I did a lot on his legacy. You can't overlook his Jesuit identity. That was the key to so much of Francis, was he was a Jesuit. And the whole discernment thing, that synodality came up out of Jesuit discernment. So we'll see now with this Pope. He described himself, remember on the Loggia, as a filio di Agostino.
Right,
He's a son of Augustine.
That's right.
And okay, that's very telling. Augustine's one of my great heroes. One of the 2 or 3 most important figures in the history of the church, period. So I'd look to all that. I quote him all the time with, Lord, you made us for yourself, therefore our heart is restless till it rests in thee. That's the greatest statement of Christian anthropology. It's the foundational statement of our anthropology. And that's very much in tune with evangelization, to know that truth. The confessions, Pope Benedict said, if he was on a desert island and had 2 books, one would be the Bible, the other would be the Confessions of Augustine. So, that's a huge influence on this man.
One of the major theological themes in St. Augustine is this hyper awareness of the depth and depravity of sin, of original sin and ongoing sin, and then the correlation of the absolute beauty and necessity of grace. So those two things together.
Right.
Do you see that as sort of influencing how he's going to see his relationship, not only with the church, but with the world? We're going to get a more sober analysis of the possibility of temporal peace, things like that?
Yeah, we'll see. Right, and like the City of God,
right.
One of his, 3 greatest works, and setting up a contrast between Rome, essentially, as this kind of paradigm of the city of man, and then the church, the city of God. And a very clear-eyed sense of the fallenness of the world, and the way we organize ourselves politically as being deeply compromised. Augustine saw all of that, and saw the church as this little, like Noah's Ark, kind of bobbing its way through the centuries, but the bearer of the true order of things. Summed up, Augustine says, in right praise. That's for the liturgy.
Right.
And I've used, ever since I read that, I've used it as a basic idea in my own thinking, is, right praise, wrong praise. And we organize ourselves incorrectly in the measure that we praise something other than God. That's always the question. So like a secular society, it's never really non-religious. Everyone's religious. You worship something. So secularity worships, pick your poison, money or sex or pleasure or power or freedom, right? Well, then you're going to organize yourselves in a dysfunctional way if you do that. But if you worship the true God, now the right kind of society will emerge. I think, sure, that's bound to influence this man's thinking. It's his whole formation.
What do you take of the motto he chose, which in Latin is in illo uno unum, which means in the one Christ we are one?
That's Augustine too,
Right.
And in his coat of arms, he's got the Augustinian, the pierced heart, right, which is a symbol of Augustine. And you think of, the cor ad cor loquitur of Newman, which is kind of an Augustinian with the restless heart and all that. And that's Augustine. In Christ, we find our unity. Don't seek it somewhere else. You seek it somewhere else, you're not going to find it. In fact, you're going to fall apart. So, right, in the one Christ, we're head and members. And so the totus Christus, Augustine says, the entire Christ, that's the church, head and members together. Where's that expressed? In the liturgy, See, and I'm influenced there by Pope Benedict, who was deeply Augustinian. Or again, the liturgy is not some little, side offering for hobbyists of Christianity. It's what it is all about. The liturgy is where we act out who we are, right? So we'll see with this man too if the liturgical interest plays itself out.
So that was Augustine's commentary on Psalm 127, and I looked it up just very briefly. I thought it was interesting. It says, "Unless the Lord build the house, they labor in vain who build it. Unless the Lord guard the city, in vain does the guard keep watch." Seems to be a shift from a focus on what can we do as individuals, what can we do in the world, to what is the Lord doing.
He's the doctor of grace, right? So grace comes first,
right,
and all that.
Do you see, so one of the comments you made on a regular basis before his election was that you were hoping to see a papacy that really stressed sort of the supernatural dimensions of the faith, specifically the proclamation of the gospel of Christ crucified and Christ resurrected. Are you seeing indications that that's where this papacy is already moving?
It's the first thing he said, isn't it, about declaring the risen Christ in the gospel? Yeah, see, what was annoying me, and I said this, I think, on X, and I said it on TV as well, is this relentless politicization. So, I mean, what's your political position on immigration? Well, all right, there are ethical and indeed political implications that follow from the gospel. True. But the gospel is not your position on immigration. The gospel is Jesus Christ risen from the dead. That's the good news. Are you able in a compelling way to announce that? Do you believe it? And do you want the world to know about it? Now, from that, follows conversion. From conversion follows moral renovation. From moral renovation follows certain political convictions. Okay. But when we rush to, okay, what's your political view on X, Y, or Z? We're missing the forest for trees, or we're missing the essential thing. The Pope's job is to declare the resurrection. So that's what the Pope should do,
So let's look at least briefly at the name that Cardinal Prevost chose, Leo XIV. Of course, this is in the line coming after Leo XIII.
Yeah.
So what significance do you see in that choice?
I see a lot in it, and I was very pleased when I heard his name, because I said this on the air too a couple times, is think of the recent papal names. Almost every one of them would have been really loaded. If you said, I'm John Paul III, okay, and now I kind of know where you are. I'm John the 24th. All right, now we know this guy's about. Yeah. I'm Pius the 13th, okay. Almost any, or I'm Francis II, right? Any of those would have right away pigeonholed someone. The fact that he went back well over 100 years to this indeed pivotal player, Pope from 1878, I think, till 1903. So it avoided this difficulty of getting pigeonholed right away. And he chose someone who indeed is reverenced by more liberal Catholics and more conservative Catholics. Leo XIII, the father of the modern Catholic social teaching tradition, Rerum Novarum. So you might say the liberal Catholics really like that, social justice. At the same time, Leo gives us the St. Michael prayer. Leo, who saw very clearly that the 20th century would be a century that belongs to the devil and would be marked by the worst kind of moral outrage. And if someone's saying that in whenever he said that, late in his life, let's say 1900, what are you talking about? The 20th century is a century of progress and science and, economic reform and liberation. No, it's the Christian century, indeed, that the magazine. That was the confidence. He was right. I mean, the 20th century, arguably, is the worst century in human history in terms of the piling up of corpses. So, I mean, talk about someone who was very clear-eyed about sin and all that. Well, that was Leo XIII.
Right.
He's also the Pope of the Thomistic revival, which is very close to my own heart. He wanted to use Aquinas not as a way to go back to the Middle Ages, but to creatively engage modernity. The Church had said no largely to the political revolution of the 18th century and the philosophical innovations of the 19th century, especially Marxism. Leo is I would say, balanced and nuanced yes and no. And he's using Aquinas to make that response. My point here is that he's kind of, in a good way, all over the place. You can find things that liberals really like, conservatives really like, moderates really like in Leo XIII. So choosing that name, I think, was a real bridge-building move on his part.
Leo XIII was really addressing the vast and rapid changes that industrialization was wreaking a lot of havoc on society. Leo XIV is really looking at AI
Yeah,
and
right.
technology. How do you see the sort of the resources that Leo XIII provided being helpful for addressing this different kind of change in
Yeah,
society?
he himself said that, didn't he, when he was asked about his name? I thought was interesting because, right, there's this sort of change in technology and in political arrangement in the late 19th century, and then something analogous going on today. Um, yeah, I mean, heck, I'd still recommend Thomas Aquinas. It's not a bad way.
It's
I mean, you want to
fascinating,
use
yeah.
Thomas to engage this new situation. But no, he's very alert to these things, which I think is quite interesting. There's nothing naive about him as he's looking at the situation today. And in choosing Leo, um, creative engagement with modernity, not simply the no, and not simply the yes of like certain post-conciliar types. They would, oh no, just the modern world sets the agenda for the
Right.
church, and we must yes to the modern world. No, as Leo said, yay and nay to the modern world of his time. So we must do that as well.
So wise.
Yeah.
In several interviews that you've already given, you've been identifying Leo XIV as a bridge figure.
Yeah.
Say a little bit more about how you interpret him in that way.
Well, I think he's alert to the fact that we have these divisions in the church. I think every smart person is. Some of the gestures he's made, many have pointed out, the wearing the mozzetta and the stole, the formal stole when he came out,
Right.
I think was a gesture to more traditional Catholics to say, I'm in the traditional garb of the Pope. Pope Francis famously eschewed all of that, right? As we record this, I think it's true that he's decided to live in the Apostolic Palace.
He has, right.
So that sort of move. And then things he said, too, that or even the singing of the Regina Caeli in Latin.
Right, that was beautiful.
Again, you might say these are little symbolic things, but we're trying to get a sense of where he's coming from. And then he's been very clear, too, about his commitment to social justice and the choice of the Leonine name and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think he's reaching out to, if you want, those two sides of the church in a good way.
Have you seen any indications yet that would help us predict how the synodal program that Francis laid out will continue or maybe not continue?
Well, he seems to be partial to it. He was part of it, and he said positive things about it. I've talked a lot about synodality. It depends on how you construe it. There were many dimensions of it that I thought were very positive. In fact, I'm having a synod in my own diocese this year in imitation of the Great Synod. And I think he affirms all of that. A church that, listens and includes more people in its decision-making process. The shadow side of it, as far as I'm concerned, is this kind of open-endedness. And what about with our doctrines being, reconsidered, things that have been sort of settled? Are they being unsettled?
Mm-hmm.
Or this sort of permanent debating society equality, like we're just going to keep talking to each other about these things endlessly, that we forget about the evangelical mission. That, to me, is the shadow side of synodality. My hope would be he retains what's good in it and cautions what's bad in it as it goes forward. But we'll have to see.
And finally, Bishop, before we turn to our listener question, what would you say are the 2 or 3 most pressing issues, both within the church and in relationship to the world, that Pope Leo is going to be confronting?
Well, first of all, I'd say that the new evangelization. I'm looking at the West. I think disaffiliation, especially of the young, being attentive to these positive signs right now of younger people who are turning toward religion. I think that's still, from Vatican II through the post-conciliar popes right up to him, is still the mission, the new evangelization, expressing the faith in a compelling way. Inside the church, the financial stuff. I heard that a lot when I was in Rome, and that's not my area. It's not my bailiwick, finances, But a lot of people said the cardinals are well aware that the church is in some trouble financially. And maybe we underestimate the role that his being an American played in, someone that can handle finances, or reconnect the church to some of its American supporters, some of whom fell away during the Francis years.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe. But I think he does have to confront that issue. And I do think clarifying the synodal reality, as we just said, it would be a desideratum. To take what's valuable in it, but also to caution, what was problematic in it, to kind of ride herd on synodality, I think would be a top priority of this Pope.
Let's now turn to our listener question. Today we have Paul, all the way from Indonesia, again showing the reach of the ministry, asking about contemporary misunderstandings of Catholic theology.
Hi, Bishop Barron. This is Paul from Indonesia. My question is, what do you believe is the most misunderstood aspect of Catholic theology today? Thank you, Bishop Barron.
It's an interesting question. The most misunderstood aspect of Catholic theology. Well, you know what? I guess I would stay with this, that people think we're obsessed with sex and that we're just puritanical. We don't like sex. It's all about limiting our sexual experience. That's what, and I said before in regard to politics, yes, we get to those issues because they're implications from the gospel, but Catholic theology is about the incarnation. It's about the glory of God being a human being fully alive. It's about God's non-competitive transcendence. It's about grace. It's about liberation from the slavery of sin. That's what it's about. We start with all that. We lead with that. It's about the liturgy as the display of the Christian life. Then we get to issues political, moral, and ultimately sexual. The trouble, I think it's misunderstood as, well, Catholic theology is all about, saying no to people's sexual desires. No, it's not that. And when the church says no, it's always a no to a no. Because in Christ is always yes. He's only yes, Paul says. So when the church says no, don't do that, it's because that in question is something negative. That is something destructive. So the church says no to the no, which means it's saying yes, right? So I think that's the most misunderstood dimension of the church.
It's the heart of affirmative orthodoxy, right?
Affirmative orthodoxy, right.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for your question. If you would like to ask Bishop Barron a question in a future Word on Fire show, please visit askbishopbarron.com. That's askbishopbarron.com. And as always, we love to hear from you. Well, Bishop, this is going to be a highly watched show, I know. Thanks for the conversation. Looking forward to the next one.
Always a pleasure. Thanks.
That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ, become a better evangelist with and for others, and work for the common good, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. And we'll see you next time.
Well, in today's episode, we're going to talk about one of the most exciting projects I think Word on Fire has ever undertaken. We've been working on it for months here, and it's been very difficult not sharing it with the world until now because we're all so passionate about it. So the easiest way to get into it is just to describe its origin. So Bishop, the whole Catholic Church has gone through this lacerating sexual abuse scandal that has undermined and harmed the church and basically every one of its dimensions. Anybody watching this knows what I'm talking about, from the revelations of then Cardinal McCarrick to the Pennsylvania grand jury report to numerous sexual abuse revelations that have come out since then. The church has just been spiraling into near despair. And so in light of that, you sat down and you wrote a new book. This is a book titled Letter to a Suffering Church. If you're watching the video version, you'll see a picture of it here on the screen. Letter to a Suffering Church, a Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. It's about 125 pages, so it's fairly lengthy, but you could still read the whole thing in maybe an hour, hour and a half. And we're going to talk about this book throughout the rest of the episode. But before we do, I wanted to highlight a couple of key facts about this book. So our goal is to get this book out to as many Catholics as possible. And to do that, we're trying to make it as cost effective as possible so as many people can get it as we can help them. So here's the deal. If you go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter, wordonfireshow.com/letter, you can get one copy of the book for free as long as you cover the shipping and handling. This is only for U.S. residents. If you're an international resident, you'll go to that site and you'll find out how you can get a digital version. But for U.S. residents, go to the website wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free print copy of the book as long as you cover the shipping. But here's the better part. If you are in a parish or in a larger small group, If you order 20 or more copies, you get the books for just $1 a copy with free shipping. $1 a copy with free shipping. So for 20 books, it's about $20. 100 books, about $100, and so on and so forth. So we encourage you to get these books for your parish and pass them out. If you're a pastor, a priest, a parish staff member, get this book for every person in their parish to give them hope, encouragement, and edification. I'll talk a little bit later in the podcast about all the extra resources we're giving you to make this effective. For example, a parish launch kit to help you launch this into your parish, an FAQ guide for priests and pastoral staff, and a 5-part video series from Bishop Barron that goes along with the book. So this is just the introductory announcement to get your book now. wordonfireshow.com/letter. Okay, Bishop, I want to spend the rest of this episode talking about what's in this book because it's just launching today, Monday, May 13th. Few people know about it yet, so I wanted to give people an overview of what's inside. So in the preface, you begin by saying, I'm not speaking in the name of my brother bishops or the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops or the Vatican. I have no authority to do so. I'm speaking in my own name as a Catholic, a priest, and a bishop. You also describe the book as a cry from the heart. It's not just sort of a bland, hollow, administrative statement. It's a real cry from your own heart. So what moved you? What compelled you to write this book in this style?
Yeah, I think, Brandon, it goes back to last summer when you and I sat down. Remember, I just was back from Ireland, and we did 2 videos on this whole issue. And those videos were really kind of a cri de coeur, as the French say, a cry from the heart. And they got a very strong reaction from people. And I think you and I began talking at that stage about maybe getting those in some kind of print form. So it's been percolating for a while. And what I wanted to do was write, it's a book, as you've been saying correctly. And actually, I haven't even seen the final version, the number of pages. But it's really a letter. And that's what it's called, a letter to a suffering church. I want it to be something that's substantive, but can be read, in 1 or 2 sittings maybe. But it was coming, you're right, out of my kind of pastoral heart. As I say there, I have no authority. I'm not speaking for the bishops. I mean, I don't have that authority. I'm not speaking for the Vatican. This is not any kind of official statement. It's simply my statement. But coming, I would say, out of, my whole life as a Catholic, 33 years as a priest, now almost 4 years as a bishop. This crisis has been, and I like that word you use, I think it was Cardinal DiNardo used it first, lacerating. It's been lacerating for the whole church, but for those of us in pastoral ministry, it has been. And it was just my pastor's heart, I think, that wanted to say something to the people of God. And the target audience of this book, even though I'm happy if non-Catholics, listen in, but the target audience is Catholics. And the image I have, Brandon, is in the wake of the McCarrick scandals last summer and fall, the number of times in my region out here in Santa Barbara, I'd go around to parishes and there I'd stand with my, mitre and crosier, and I'm fully symbolizing the church. The number of people that came up to me, not so much in anger, but in deep grief, I would say, with tears in their eyes, grief over the church. And the book, the letter, is my attempt to respond to that pastoral need. So it's no more, no less than that, I would say. I don't want people to read it as, oh, this is the official statement of the American bishops. Nothing of the kind. I mean, I don't have authority to do that. But it's from my own pastor's heart, I would say.
I know all of us at Word on Fire were deeply concerned when this new survey came out from Gallup, one of the largest religious sociological groups in the country. And it revealed that 37% of American Catholics, 37% of Americans who identify as Catholic, who say I'm Catholic, have considered leaving the church as a result of these sexual abuse revelations. Now, they go deeper and that number changes depending on how often you go to Mass, predictably, all that kind of stuff. But the simple fact that almost 40% of our own people are sitting on the fence and they're thinking, maybe I should go, maybe I should stay. It seems like those are the people that you want to draw back to the church.
Yeah. I mean, I got it when I read that survey. I got it, but it broke my heart at the same time. I say it bluntly in the book. There's never a good reason to leave the Catholic Church. Now, again, I understand emotionally. I understand why people feel deep frustration. I feel it.
but there's never a good reason to absent oneself from the font of grace. I mean, to leave the mystical body of Jesus. There's never a good reason for that. I don't care how badly church people behave. I don't care how grave the sin is on the part of church people. There's never a good reason to leave. And part of the reason I wrote the book was to make that case, is to say that, yes, this exists, this terrible, lacerating crisis. Yes, we have to be absolutely clear-eyed about it. But no, it's never a legitimate reason for leaving the church. In some ways, the book turns on those two hinges, I think.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. Bishop Barron just released this book today. You can get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. You can get a free copy mailed to you as long as you cover the shipping, or you can buy bulk copies for your whole parish or your group for just $1 a copy with free shipping. So wordonfireshow.com/letter. Bishop, the book has 5 chapters, and I want to spend time talking about...
Before we start, Brandon, can I just say a word? Because, yes, we want this book to get out. I want it to be widely read, but, we've been very strong on this, that we're not making a penny of money on this book. We're trying to make it, first of all, as available as possible, right? As cheaply as possible. We've done that through various means. But secondly, any profit that might be derived from the sale of this book is going to go automatically, immediately into charities dedicated to helping victims of sexual abuse. And I just want people to be really clear about that, because the last thing in the world we wanted to do was give the impression that we're, trying to make money off of this terrible time in the church. The goal is simply to get it out to as many people as possible.
I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks. Also, anybody who knows anything about printing and shipping books knows that if you offer a book for $1 a copy, that's far less than it costs to print and ship books out. So we've also been helped by generous donors who have helped get the cost down, because they believe in this mission of getting the book out through parishes to as many people as possible. Good. Okay, well, before we dive into each of these 5 chapters, one more question. What do you think sets this book apart from other statements about the abuse crisis? And I don't just mean from other bishops, but multiple journalists and stories and articles and books and blogs, have covered the abuse crisis from so many angles. What sets your book apart?
Well, what I always found, Brandon, was missing in so many of the accounts, and as indispensable as they are, so don't get me wrong, that we analyze this thing from a sociological, cultural, psychological, legal standpoint, all that remains indispensably valuable. But what I often found missing was a theological and spiritual and biblical reading of this crisis. And maybe, if I could say, one of the original elements in this book is the section where I go into the Bible and how the Bible sheds considerable light on this problem of sexual abuse and sexual misconduct. But I'm trying to read it from a consistently spiritual and theological standpoint, without eschewing for a minute those other points of view, but that's not my focus. And I think that's the novelty of this book.
All right, so let's go through each of the 5 chapters in the book, Letter to a Suffering Church. Chapter 1 is titled The Devil's Masterpiece. What do you talk about there?
That's a phrase I used, I think, when we had those videos, right, last summer. I might have used that phrase kind of spontaneously, a diabolical masterpiece, because I don't think it's possible to read this crisis simply from a natural or purely human standpoint. To me, in its destructiveness, in its comprehensiveness, it's just too well thought through. I've often said, if you were trying to find the best way to undermine the church in every aspect of its life, I challenge you to come up with a better plan than this one. I just don't think an appeal to the purely natural is sufficient to account for how devastatingly destructive this has been. And I've been, very influenced too by the Pope's insistence that we read this thing spiritually. The devil is described as the enemy of the human race, but more specifically, the enemy of the church. I mean, the devil hates the church because the church is trying to bring people to Christ. If you're this very powerful and deeply intelligent spiritual being, what are you going to come up with? It seems to me this crisis has been a diabolical masterpiece. It's a masterwork of wicked undermining of the church's life. So I begin with that observation, Now, I'm very quick to point out, because anticipating, sort of dualistic critiques. The minute you invoke the devil, people say, oh, well, isn't that convenient? The devil did it and we have nothing to do with it. Well, of course not. I mean, of course not. There's a kind of, it's a perverse simulacrum of the way we cooperate with God's grace, right? God's grace awakens our cooperation. Well, in a similar way, it's a perverse, simulacrum, but the devil calls forth our cooperation. And he does so typically through insinuation, through temptation, through suggestion, etc. And I use the example of the wonderful fresco of the Antichrist in Orvieto, Luca Signorelli's masterpiece of the devil putting his arm through the vesture of the Antichrist in such a way that it looks for all the world like it's the Antichrist's arm, but in fact it's the devil's. That hits very well, catches very well how this dynamic unfolds. So to say it's a diabolical masterpiece is not for a second to say that we weren't very involved in it, that human beings in their sinfulness were very involved. It's a both and, not an either or.
Why is it so important to recognize the devil's role in this abuse crisis? Why can't we just say, oh, it's just a bunch of wicked men? Why is his role significant?
Because we won't understand it and therefore be able to respond to it adequately unless we are fully honest about it. That's why we anticipate the end of the book, the way forward. A lot of it is a spiritual renewal of the church. It's not just let's get our legal situation in better shape. Let's just improve our psychological screening and formation. Again, as important as those are, I'm not gainsaying either one for one moment. Don't get me wrong, but that's not enough. That what's called for ultimately is a spiritual renewal and an acknowledgement that we're involved in a struggle, right? In a spiritual warfare. And I think that's key to understanding this crisis in its complexity.
So that was chapter 1, The Devil's Masterpiece. Chapter 2 is titled Light from Scripture. What can the Bible teach us in regards to this crisis?
And I think here, Brandon, a lot of people might be surprised how clear-eyed the Bible is about this problem. Now, it's complex. The Bible is deeply appreciative of the role of human sexuality. The Bible's not a puritanical text. I've said 1,000 times. It's not a dualistic text. From the very beginning, God created all things spiritual and material, found them all very good. And furthermore, go forth and multiply, right, is one of the great commands of the Bible. In fact, whenever the covenant gets ratified throughout the Old Testament, it's usually accompanied by this command to go forth and multiply. Marriage, sexuality, family, the joy of sex, all of that is frankly celebrated by the Bible. It's part of God's great plan. Okay, now, there's a shadow side, because the Bible, as I say, is so clear-eyed about the myriad ways that we human beings tend to get off kilter, right? Well, sex and family and so on are so beautiful that when they get off kilter, they become deeply corrupt, right? And so we find that in the Bible. And this might surprise people, but walk your way through the Bible, Old Testament and New, you'll find lots of references to this problem. One that always comes to my mind, because I develop it a bit in the book, it's such a clear, distant mirror, if I can use Barbara Tuchman's famous phrase, that we look at this story and we see ourselves, but a long, long time ago. The story of Eli the high priest and his sons Hophni and Phinehas, priests, right? And Hophni and Phinehas, deeply corrupt, both financially and sexually, abusing their people. Complaints are brought to Eli, the high priest. He pays lip service to it and urges the sons to, get it together, but they don't, and he doesn't follow up. And the result of this corruption, both the actual abuse and the overlooking of the abuse by an authority figure, Eli, the result is disaster for Israel. The loss of the ark, the loss of 30,000 soldiers, the loss of their political prestige, and the loss of life. Hophni, Phinehas, and Eli all are killed, right? Or the two sons are killed. Eli dies when he hears the news. Now, my point is, that story should sound pretty familiar to us in the last 25 years, right? Bad priests abusing their people, complaints brought forward to authority figures who say nice things but don't do very much. The result, disaster for the new Israel that we call the church. So I talk about that story and a number of others too. And then Jesus, I culminate with the Lord Jesus himself and the importance of children for Jesus as signs of the kingdom. Jesus putting his arm, that beautiful image, around the little child. Unless you change and become like one of these, unless you welcome, he who welcomes him welcomes me and welcomes him who sent me, etc. That children who were kind of marginal figures in Old Testament or in biblical times are brought so central by Jesus. So anyway, I develop a number of these things in that chapter. And I think as I look at this issue and the treatment of it, I don't find that very often, the biblical light being shed. So I think that's a helpful, perspective.
So that's chapter number 2, Light from Scripture. Chapter number 3 is titled, We Have Been Here Before. What's your purpose in this chapter?
Yeah, I start there with, he's still alive, my old church history professor, Father Charlie Meyer, taught generations of Chicago priests, including my own generation. And Charlie was a brilliant guy and loved taking us through the glories of church history. But he also took a kind of, I think, devilish delight in also showing us a lot of the corruption in church history, the corrupt priests and monks and popes, etc. And as I say in the book, for a lot of us who were kind of novices at that time, it was a little bit shocking. We had perhaps a naive, somewhat romantic view of the church and all these glorious figures. But then to hear of the deep corruption, even on the part of church leaders. But what I argue there is that in a way it was a very good immunization, if you want, is I got immunized by Charlie Meyer against being too scandalized. That, all right, the church has had bad people, even in very high positions, who've done terrible things. But we've survived. And in fact, in many cases, the corruption called forth the renewal associated with the really great figures in church history. It's not to excuse the corruption for a second, but it's to show somehow in God's providence, as the bark of Peter makes its way through the stormy waters, it's got, a lot of ups and downs. And so it's not to marginalize or to minimize what's happening now by any means, but it's to put it in a wider context. I also spent a little bit of time there with the famous Peter Damian story from the 11th century. St. Peter Damian, right? Great hermit and mystic and scholar and so on. But Peter Damian is famous for raising his very eloquent and strong voice against precisely sexual corruption in the church and on the part of high church leaders who were taking advantage of seminary and young priests. And again, talk about a distant mirror. You say the McCarrick crisis from last summer. Look back over 1,000 years in history. You'll see a distant mirror of the same thing. So I think it's helpful just to see what the body of Christ has endured over the centuries and how, despite all that, we've managed to survive. That's an important lesson, I think.
So that's chapter 3. We have been here before. Chapter 4 is when I think your blood really starts flowing. You get really excited and passionate because this one's titled, Why Should We Stay? I mentioned earlier that statistic from the Gallup survey that said 37% of American Catholics are considering leaving. Why should they stay? Why should they not leave the church?
Because we got a treasure in earthen vessels. So I use the Pauline image there as my master metaphor. And how helpful, at the very beginning of the church, Paul gave us that metaphor. The earthen vessels are obvious. It's us, right? The church. We're flawed, we're fragile, we're very breakable. But strangely, in those earthen vessels, there is a treasure, and the treasure is Christ. And the church, despite its failures and its fragility and its flaws, has borne that treasure up and down the centuries. Now, where do you find it? Well, you find it in the scriptures that have been preserved and commented upon by the church. You find it in the liturgy of the church. You find it in the sacraments. You find it especially in the Eucharist. You find it in the lives of the saints. You find it in the great works of art the church has propagated and so on. In all these ways, the treasure is on display, and it's because of the treasure that we stay. What we should never do is say, oh, look at all these fragile, broken vessels. Well, yeah, from Paul's time on, we should expect a lot of broken, fragile vessels. But we don't stay because of the vessels. We stay because of the treasure. And I want people not to be so preoccupied with the fragility of the vessels that they overlook what's on offer and what is still on offer, which are all the things I mentioned, and more. And that's why I say there's never a good reason to leave the church. Well, they're all so corrupt. Everyone, it seems to be so. Yeah, but the Eucharist. Well, there's all these sins. Yeah, but Christ made available in the sacraments. Oh, there's these priests and bishops have been so. Yeah, but salvation offered. See, so the yeah, but there is the insistence upon the treasure that persists despite the fragility of the vessels.
All right, let's talk about the fifth and final chapter. This one is titled The Way Forward. And I know a lot of people getting this book are going to flip right to that chapter because they're going to say, okay, I'm with you. We should stay. Corrupt men in the church aren't good reasons to leave. But what do? We still got to do something to reform the church, to make sure this stuff doesn't happen again. What do you propose in this fifth and final chapter?
Well, Brandon, one thing I do there is to insist upon something that the church has done a great deal in terms of protocols and reforms and laws and so on. And I talk briefly, but I talk about the 2002 Dallas Accords, right? In the wake of the first wave of this great scandal, the church did respond with extraordinarily good and effective protocols. And I say that not just because I'm a Catholic bishop, but because you can prove it statistically that after 2002, when these protocols were in place, the number of abuse cases, fell off the table. And just analyze any of the statistics there of this thing peaking, in the 1970s, maybe early 1980s, trending downward, but then downward precipitously after 2002. So I think we have to give full credit to the Dallas Accords. I was a seminary rector, and so the Dallas Accords very much affected my work because we're screening candidates. Well, the background checks, and you're at the level of like FBI kind of background checks of these students, the psychological exams, the number of interviews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The institutional awareness of this problem, I would say, is so clear. I subscribe to the view, many have said this, but I don't know any institution in the world right now where children are safer from this point of view than the Catholic Church because of these protocols. So anyway, I spend a good deal of time insisting upon that. But I then add, and go back to the beginning of the book now, it's not just a matter of protocols, as indispensable as they are. It's also a matter of real spiritual reform. And I use kind of blunt, frank language first about the priesthood, that who can deny, and this is not a blanket condemnation, and the vast majority of priests are good and decent men and so on, but that there was some kind of rot in the priesthood that allowed this abuse to happen. And you can look at that in a number of levels, both the abuse itself, but also the kind of overlooking of the abuse or looking the other way, not taking it with sufficient seriousness. What was it in far too many priests and bishops that kind of allowed this thing to unfold? I make some suggestions there about how the priesthood has to be renewed. But also, and again, this is not to say, hey, we're all equally to blame. That's not the case. I'm not denying for a second how central the corruption of the clergy is here. But clergy don't come out of a vacuum, right? They come up out of a culture. They come up out of, in the vast majority of cases, Catholic families. Is there a need for the whole church to be renewed? Yeah, it seems to me. A rededication to prayer, a rededication to the sacraments, a rededication to life in Christ. Have we allowed ourselves as a church in its totality to drift away from Christ? And I think the answer there is clearly yes. So I make some more suggestions there about how the church as a whole should be spiritually renewed. So that's the way forward. It is laws and protocols, et cetera. But more deeply, and this was the case when St. Francis called for reform, when St. Dominic called for reform, when Ignatius of Loyola called for reform, it's a spiritual renovation that matters above all.
Well, we're hoping that this new book, Letter to a Suffering Church, gets into the hands of millions of Catholics all over the country, Bishop. But if you could just say one thing to the Catholic Church in America, one rousing word when it comes to the sexual abuse crisis as a pastor, as a bishop, what one thing would you like to say to them?
I'd say stay and fight. And in fact, we were thinking about titles for the book. That was actually a title we thought about. Stay and fight. this is not the time to leave. So I understand the 37%. And again, I understand it. I get it. I'm not trying to undermine that point of view. I get it. But this is not the time to leave. It's the time precisely to stay and to fight for what's best and right in the church. I use the example, I think we did it in our video last summer of Lincoln. It was a great hero of mine. Where there are many people at the time of the Civil War, especially once the war got really dicey, and people were dying in their tens of thousands, who were saying, "Oh, come on, let's just get out of this thing. Let's end this goofy war and let the South have their way, and let's just end the fight." And Lincoln's genius, was to, despite all that opposition, despite the terrible quality of the struggle, to say, no, we have to hang in there and fight, because he saw the institution of slavery as a fundamental undermining of the very nature of American democracy, in a way that this rot that's in the church is undermining what we're supposed to be. All right, fight it, stay, redouble efforts. This is not the time to leave, but to stay and fight. That'd be my last word to Catholics.
So again, the book is titled Letter to a Suffering Church, A Bishop Speaks on the Sexual Abuse Crisis. You can get a free copy if you cover the shipping at wordonfireshow.com/letter. But more importantly, we're encouraging you, please invite your parish to get copies for everyone in your parish community. You can get them for just $1 a copy with free shipping. All profits from the sale of this book go to charities that serve people who have been sexually abused. So we think this project is just win-win-win all the way around. We want to help the church and we want to help the victims. So please get your copy at wordonfireshow.com/letter. Well, that sound means it is time for a question from one of our listeners. And today we have a question from Bob, who lives in North Carolina, and he's asking about what the church teaches about revelation, whether it's something that happened once or something that's ongoing. So here's Bob's question.
Hey, Bishop Barron, this is Bob from North Carolina. Our parish here is currently doing the study guide for the Mass, and one of the things that it talked about when it pushed us back towards the Catechism was a term called amnesis, which I believe is something that is a Platonic from Plato type term. My question is, if we start with Plato and we learn from those things and that grows into the Old Testament and that leads to the New Testament, does the church feel like we're really there yet, or are we continuing to evolve and still having things revealed to us even today? Thank you very much.
Good. That's a searching question. First, anamnesis, word meaning memory, it's a Greek term, obviously, but it's not derived so much from Plato's sense, which is it's used in an epistemological context for Plato, that when we come to know something, we're actually remembering, what we knew when we lived in the realm of the form. So they're not using it in that way. Biblically, it's much more of a Jewish term. And it's the idea of the recuperation of history is not just a distant recalling, but a real participation in. So just that clarification, the anamnesis in question is not Platonic, it's much more biblical. But to your point, has the church used Platonic philosophy? Yeah, read everybody from Justin Martyr through Augustine of Hippo, and you find a lot of our major players using Platonic philosophy to explicate Christian theology. Can we use Aristotle? Famously, Aquinas does. Can we use all kinds of other people, as John Henry Newman used Locke and Hume, etc.? Sure. That's the Catholic genius. It's part of the both and, faith and reason, but also the Newman idea of the development of doctrine. So it doesn't mean that new doctrines are coming. So revelation, in one very important sense, is closed. It ended with the last book of the New Testament. That's when formal revelation ended. We're not expecting anything new to come at that level. However, what was given to us is like a seed that's now going to grow into a great tree. It's like the beginning of a river that's now going to unfold. Part of that unfolding process is indeed the use of whatever cultural forms we might find expedient to that purpose. So that's part of the Catholic genius. We don't get new doctrines, but doctrine unfolds, and it can do so through the influence of philosophy and so on. That's a very, very quick answer to your question that requires really a whole course in fundamental theology.
Well, before we wrap up here, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about our new way of supporting the podcast through Patreon. And we have a lot of patrons who have joined and wanted to be a part of helping out this show. So I wanted to give a quick shout out to several patrons who have donated at significant levels. They include Eric Hansen, Jacqueline Yoder, James Siddlington, Jamie Capetta, John Brenton, John Mattini, Juan Solaris, Karen Perry, Mark Rogers, Matt Gamble. All of you, thank you, thank you, thank you. On behalf of Bishop Barron, the whole Word on Fire team, we're so grateful for your support in helping get this show out to more people. So to all of you and to all of our patrons, I wanted to just express thanks on this episode and all future episodes as well. Well, one final reminder here before we wrap up, get your copy of the new book. Again, it's called Letter to a Suffering Church by Bishop Barron. Just came out today. You can get your copy by visiting wordonfireshow.com/letter. Get one free copy for yourself, but then more importantly, share it with your pastor, share it with your parish staff, encourage them to get copies for your whole parish. You can get them for just $1 a copy plus free shipping. All of the proceeds go to support charities that minister to victims of sexual abuse. Well, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.
Well, I just read the most recent Pew Forum study of religion, and sometimes I wonder why I read these things, because the news, again, is pretty bad. And I would say this, it confirms a lot of my own intuitions the last many years. What I'm talking about here is this recent study of Catholic belief around the Eucharist. Now, any Catholic worth his salt or her salt knows this is a central teaching of Catholicism, that Jesus is really, truly, and substantially present under the forms of bread and wine, right? It's a basic tenet of Catholicism. The Pew Forum study revealed that overall, 75% of Catholics, mind you, not just anyone out in the street, 75% of Catholics think the Eucharist is a nice symbol of Jesus. Now, go to the younger cohort, 40 and younger, it now goes up to 80% think that the Eucharist is a nice symbol of Jesus. Well, it came right to my mind, one of my heroes, Flannery O'Connor, of course, when it was proposed to her, the Eucharist is a lovely symbol. She said, well, if it's only a symbol, I say to hell with it. And that's a very good way to sum up the Catholic attitude toward the Eucharist. If it's only a symbol, why bother? I mean, you and I can come up with a symbol of Abraham Lincoln, or a symbol, for that matter, of Jesus, if we want to. Big deal. What's central to Catholicism is the claim that Jesus is really, truly, and substantially present. Okay, that to me should be a commonplace, affirmed throughout the tradition, affirmed up to the Catechism of 1993, central to the Catholic faith. And now, 75% of our own people don't believe it. As I've been saying for a long time, it represents a massive failure. And I include myself in this. We're all guilty. A massive failure on the part of Catholic educators and catechists, evangelists, teachers. I don't know any way to say it nicely, but if on this central matter of our belief and practice, there's this much deep misunderstanding, something has gone substantially wrong. Now, here's the other thing, and I've been talking about this recently a lot. There are those in the church today, and I just think it's so stupid, that want to drive a wedge between apologetics or catechesis or the intellectual on the one hand, and then, being friendly and reaching out to people on the other hand. So, well, just do that and we'll be great. And, all this apologetics, intellectual stuff, that's all beside the point. Yeah, tell me about it. How's that worked out for us? How's that little strategy? And trust me, I grew up with it. I know all about it. Go back to the 1960s and 70s. When I was a kid, it was all about let's be nice and let's reach out and don't worry about books and ideas and all that. Well, what we're seeing is the bitter fruit of it. That's what happens when you utterly bracket the apologetic, the catechetical, the intellectual. You get 75% of our own people don't believe a central teaching of our faith. And so I would say, again, I'm blaming myself, bishops, priests, everybody. Don't write me letters and say, you're picking on catechists. We're all guilty, okay? But it's been a massive failure on the part of the church carrying on its own tradition. Here's the other thing too that strikes me is, again, I grew up with this church, and it's making a comeback now. My suspicion is a lot of people might say, "Oh well, who cares if people don't believe in the real presence, as long as they're committed, to the poor, or they're committed to social justice. Isn't that what really matters?" Well, of course, that's a Kantianism, as I've said many times. That's a reduction of religion to morality, which is repugnant to Catholicism. Caring for the poor is an essential aspect of the church's life, but it's not the whole of the church's life. But more to it. Look at the truly great figures in our tradition who cared for the poor. Go back to Vincent de Paul. Come up through Mother Teresa and Dorothy Day. Look at one of my heroes, Reynold Hillenbrand, who was great, committed to social justice. What do they have in common, all these people? What they have in common is a profound understanding of and love for the Eucharist. If you line up Dorothy Day, Catherine Drexel, Jacques Maritain, Reynold Hillenbrand, Vincent de Paul in this room, and you said, "Hey, is the Eucharist a nice symbol of Jesus?" They'd go into open rebellion. My point is, you take away these key doctrines. And of course, the Eucharist is tied to the divinity of Jesus. It's tied to the incarnation, tied to the sacraments and to the church and to everything else. You take away the central teachings of our church at the doctrinal level. Trust me when I tell you, you will take away eventually the commitment to the poor. That will evanesce as quickly as the doctrines have evanesced. It belongs together as a whole, Now, perhaps you've gathered by now that I'm rather animated about this, because this to me is a deeply disturbing statistic, and it should be a wake-up call to all of us. And don't listen to people who want to drive a wedge between our pastoral, friendliness to people and catechesis. That's led us nowhere. Or those that want to drive a wedge between doctrine and the social work of the church. That brings us nowhere. So I think this should be a bit of a wake-up call, and should be a call to action on the part of everybody in the church.